They sold you a story, wrapped it in destiny, timing, and coincidence, told you there was one person out there who would see you completely and never flinch. They called it fate because fate sounds cleaner than reality, cleaner than choice, cleaner than accountability. And you believed it not because you were weak, but because believing felt better than sitting with the mess of human desire. Funny thing is, the truth doesn't come out gently. It doesn't arrive with violins or closure. It slips out sideways, through patterns you ignored, through words that didn't match actions, through the quiet moments where something always felt off, but you told yourself it was just fear. The shocking part isn't that the truth came out. It's how long it was visible before you were ready to see it. A soulmate isn't revealed by promises. It's revealed by pressure, by conflict, by consistency. And when the illusion cracks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It creaks slowly. You start noticing how love was conditional, how understanding had limits, how connection was strongest when it was convenient. That's when the myth starts sweating. That's when the story stops protecting you and starts exposing you. People don't talk about how dangerous the soulmate narrative can be. It convinces you to tolerate things you'd never excuse otherwise. It teaches you to reinterpret disrespect as complexity, distance as mystery, emotional absence as depth. You keep rewriting the script to keep the character alive, because if this isn't your soulmate, then you have to confront the uncomfortable truth that connection alone isn't salvation, that chemistry isn't commitment, that intensity doesn't equal alignment. And when the truth finally comes out, it doesn't ask for your permission. It shows up in clarity you can't unsee, in the moment you stop defending them to yourself, in the moment you realize love was doing all the heavy lifting while honesty took the back seat. That's when the shock hits, not because they changed, but because you stopped pretending they would. The soulmate story was a comforting lie, not because it was cruel, but because it was convenient. It gave chaos a shape. It turned randomness into romance and coincidence into confirmation. It told you there was one person designed to fit you perfectly, which meant you didn't have to think too hard about compatibility, effort, or boundaries. You didn't have to question why things felt off sometimes. You just had to believe harder. Belief became the glue that held everything together, even when the pieces didn't actually match. That story works best when you're vulnerable, when you want meaning more than truth, when you're tired of uncertainty and the idea of meant to be feels like relief. A soulmate narrative promises inevitability. It tells you that if it's difficult, it's deep. If it hurts, it matters. If it's confusing, it's profound. And slowly, without realizing it, you start measuring love by intensity instead of stability, by drama instead of consistency. You stop asking whether something is healthy and start asking whether it's destined. The lie isn't obvious at first, it's subtle. It shows up in how much you excuse, how many red flags you repaint as personality quirks, how often you explain away silence, distance, or disrespect because this connection is different. You don't notice the cost because the story keeps paying you in hope. Every time something breaks, destiny steps in to justify it. Every time you feel unseen, fate tells you patience will be rewarded. And patience becomes your personality. What makes it comforting is that it removes responsibility. If someone is your soulmate, then the relationship doesn't need maintenance, just endurance. Problems aren't signals, they're tests. Misalignment isn't incompatibility, it's timing. You're not supposed to leave, you're supposed to wait. You're not supposed to question, you're supposed to trust. And that trust slowly shifts away from yourself and toward the story you're clinging to. The real damage happens quietly. You stop noticing how much effort is one-sided, how often you're the one explaining, forgiving, adapting. You call it love, but it's labor. Emotional labor performed under the illusion of destiny, And because the story says this person is special, irreplaceable, you tolerate things you would never accept from anyone else. The lie doesn't trap you with chains, it traps you with meaning. People around you might see it before you do. They ask gentle questions, they raise concerns. But the soulmate story is airtight. Any doubt from the outside feels like an attack on something sacred. You defend it fiercely, not because it's strong, but because it's fragile. Because if the story collapses, you're left with the uncomfortable reality that connection doesn't guarantee care, and chemistry doesn't guarantee commitment. That realization threatens everything you've invested. The lie also flatters you. It tells you you were chosen, that this connection happened because of who you are, because of some cosmic alignment. That makes it harder to let go, because letting go feels like losing a part of your identity. You weren't just in a relationship, you were in a story. And stories are harder to abandon than facts. Facts don't promise redemption arcs. Stories do. Over time, cracks appear, not dramatic ones. Small inconsistencies, patterns that don't change, apologies. Without behavior shifts. Love that's loud in words but quiet in action. You notice that the connection thrives on uncertainty but struggles with stability. That the moments of closeness are intense, but the foundation is thin. And still the story whispers that this is normal. That great love is supposed to hurt a little, or a lot. The comforting part of the lie is that it delays clarity. It lets you stay suspended between hope and reality. It gives you a reason to keep trying without demanding evidence that trying is working. It reframes stagnation as patience and avoidance as mystery. And by the time the truth starts pushing through, you've already given so much of yourself that walking away feels like erasing history. But the truth doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It just accumulates. It stacks moments. It repeats patterns until denial gets tired. And when you finally see it, the shock isn't betrayal. The shock is recognition. The realization that the story protected you from seeing what was actually happening. That the soulmate idea didn't deepen the connection. It distracted you from its limits. What's left after that isn't bitterness. It's clarity. An uncomfortable, grounding clarity that doesn't promise magic, but offers something more honest. The understanding that love isn't found, it's built. That alignment matters more than intensity. That destiny is often just a story people tell when they don't want to confront choice. And once that comforting lie dissolves, you don't lose love. You lose illusion. And illusion was never going to carry you where you thought it would. Truth reveals itself through patterns, not promises. And that's the part nobody wants to look at because patterns don't flatter anyone. Promises sound good. They're dramatic, emotional, cinematic. They make you feel chosen in the moment. Patterns are boring by comparison, quiet, repetitive. Hey, don't seduce you. They expose you. And that's exactly why people cling to words while ignoring behavior. Words give hope. Patterns demand accountability. At first, you treat promises like currency. You collect them, you remember them, you replay them when things feel off. You tell yourself that what was said matters more than what's happening. Because if you trusted patterns, you'd have to confront the uncomfortable truth that the same situations keep repeating with different excuses attached. That the same apologies arrive without new behavior. That the same conflicts resurface no matter how many conversations you have. Patterns don't argue back, they just keep showing up. What makes promises dangerous is how personal they feel. They look you in the eye, they say your name, they swear intention. And intention feels intimate. It feels like proof of care, but intention without follow-through is just imagination spoken out loud. Patterns are what intention looks like when no one is watching. Patterns are what someone does when they're tired, stressed, bored, or inconveniently honest. And that's where the truth lives. People don't lie as often as they repeat themselves. That's the part that stings. Most of the time, the truth is right there in the consistency of their actions, in how they respond when you need them, in how they disappear when accountability enters the room, in how effort spikes only when they feel you slipping away. Those are patterns, and patterns are honest in a way promises never are. You tell yourself this time is different, that the context changed, that the apology sounded sincere, that the explanation made sense. And maybe it did, individually. But patterns aren't interested in individual moments. They're interested in accumulation, in frequency, in what happens most often, not what happens when someone is trying to fix things temporarily. That's why patterns feel so unforgiving. They don't care how badly you want something to be true. There's a point where ignoring patterns becomes an act of self-betrayal. You start editing reality to protect a story you're attached to. You minimize, you rationalize, you blame timing, stress, past trauma, anything that keeps the promise alive. Because letting go of the promise means admitting you trusted words over evidence. And that realization hurts more than the truth itself. Patterns also don't require interpretation. They don't need decoding, they don't hide behind nuance. If someone consistently shows up late, withdraws during conflict, avoids difficult conversations, or only engages when it benefits them, that's not complexity, that's consistency. Calling it complicated is just a way to delay acceptance. Patterns simplify things brutally. They strip away fantasy and leave you with what is. And the real shock isn't seeing the pattern. It's realizing how long it's been there, how many times you noticed it and talked yourself out of it, how many red flags you folded neatly into hope. Because patterns don't suddenly appear. They build quietly while you're busy believing the next promise will finally override the last behavior. Promises feel like progress. Patterns reveal stagnation. People who rely on promises often get angry when you bring up patterns. They accuse you of living in the past, of holding grudges, of not seeing growth. But patterns aren't about the past. They're about repetition in the present. Growth changes patterns. Accountability disrupts patterns. When neither happens, the pattern is the message, no matter how eloquent the words sound. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop negotiating with patterns, when you stop asking why and start acknowledging what. Why invites stories? What invites decisions? Why keeps you apt in analysis? What pushes you toward action? And action doesn't need promises to survive. It needs honesty. Patterns don't promise change. They show you likelihood. They show you probability. They show you what tomorrow will look like if nothing shifts. And when you accept that, you're no longer confused. You're just faced with a choice you were postponing. Whether to keep believing what someone says or to finally respect what they consistently do. The truth doesn't explode. It settles. It becomes obvious in hindsight. You look back and realize you weren't misled by lies as much as you were distracted by words. That the truth was steady, repetitive, almost boring in its consistency. That it didn't need to announce itself because it was always there, waiting for you to stop listening to promises long enough to notice the pattern they were trying to cover. Intensity is not the same as alignment, but it's an easy mistake to make when emotions are loud. Intensity feels like fire. It feels urgent, consuming, impossible to ignore. It grabs your attention and convinces you that something powerful must also be something right. Your heart races, your thoughts spiral, your world narrows until that connection feels like the center of everything. And when something feels that strong, questioning it feels almost disrespectful, like doubting gravity while you're falling. Alignment, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't overwhelm your nervous system. It doesn't keep you guessing where you stand. And that's exactly why it's often overlooked. People raised on chaos mistake calm for boredom. They confuse peace with a lack of passion. So when intensity shows up dramatic and consuming, it gets mistaken for destiny. You tell yourself this must be real because it hurts, because it excites, because it destabilizes you in ways nothing else ever has. The problem. M is intensity thrives on imbalance. It feeds on uncertainty, inconsistency, and emotional spikes. One moment you feel chosen, the next you feel invisible. One moment you're pulled close, the next you're pushed away. That push and pull creates addiction, not connection. Your nervous system stays on edge, constantly anticipating the next high. And you call that chemistry. You call that love. But what it really is a system trained to chase relief. Alignment doesn't require that chase. Alignment shows itself in rhythm, not adrenaline, in shared values, not shared chaos, in how conflicts are handled, not how intense the apologies sound, in whether your lives move in the same direction, not how passionately you collide when they cross. But alignment doesn't create fireworks. It creates stability. And stability doesn't impress people who learn to equate love with emotional turbulence. Intensity also disguises incompatibility. When emotions are strong, they drown out practical questions. You stop asking whether you want the same things, whether your boundaries are respected, whether communication actually works. The feeling becomes the evidence. And as long as the feeling is alive, you tolerate misalignment. You convince yourself that the friction is proof of depth, that the struggle means something important is happening. That's where the confusion sets in. Because intensity feels meaningful. It feels transformative. It feels like growth. But growth that only happens through pain isn't growth, it's conditioning. You're adapting to instability instead of building something sustainable. And the longer you stay in it, the harder it becomes to imagine connection without chaos. Calm starts to feel suspicious. Consistency feels unfamiliar. You mistake safety for lack of attraction because your system has been trained to respond to volatility. People often defend intense connections fiercely. They say outsiders don't understand. They say it's complicated. They say it's deep. But complexity isn't the same as compatibility. Depth isn't measured by how much you suffer. And understanding someone doesn't mean enduring misalignment indefinitely. Intensity can coexist with care, but without alignment, it burns fast and unevenly. One person gets scorched while the other walks away warmed. Alignment shows itself when things aren't dramatic, when there's stress, when there's boredom, when there's disagreement. It's in how decisions are made, how responsibility is shared, how effort is distributed. Intensity shows up strongest in moments of reunion and conflict. Alignment shows up in routine, in the boring middle, in the everyday choices that don't make good stories but make stable lives. The hardest realization is that intensity can exist without commitment, without accountability, without longevity. People can feel deeply and still be incapable of showing up consistently. They can crave you emotionally while avoiding you practically. And intensity makes it easy to overlook that gap. It keeps you focused on how it feels instead of how it functions. When the truth finally settles in, it's not explosive, it's sobering. You realize the connection was powerful but directional only in moments, not in life. You see that alignment would have required changes neither of you made, and that no amount of feeling could compensate for the absence of shared movement. The shock isn't that the intensity was fake, it's that you mistook intensity for proof of something it was never designed to provide, because alignment doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't rely on emotional extremes to feel alive. It doesn't require you to abandon yourself to keep the connection intact. It doesn't confuse longing with belonging. And once you understand that difference, you stop chasing fire and start recognizing structure. You stop romanticizing emotional chaos and start valuing emotional safety. You stop asking how strongly it feels and start asking how well it holds up when the intensity fades, and what remains is the reality you have to live inside of every day love was doing all the work. And that's the part nobody wants to admit because it exposes the imbalance you tried so hard to normalize. You told yourself relationships require effort, compromise, patience, all true. But effort turned into exhaustion, compromise turned into self-erasure, and patience turned into waiting for someone to become who they kept promising they were. Love became a one-person job dressed up as a partnership. At first, it didn't feel wrong. You like giving, you like understanding, you like being the one who holds things together when they start to crack. It made you feel valuable, necessary. You confused being needed with being loved, and no one corrected you because the arrangement worked perfectly for the other side. As long as you kept showing up, fixing, forgiving, adjusting, nothing had to change. Love picked up the slack every time accountability was missing. When communication failed, love explained it away. When effort dropped, love compensated. When respect slipped, love reframed it as stress or misunderstanding. Love became the buffer between reality and the story you wanted to believe. And the more love worked overtime, the more invisible the imbalance became. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being in a connection where you're the engine. You're together, but you're alone in the responsibility. You're the one initiating conversations, planning the future, repairing conflicts, maintaining emotional safety. The other person participates just enough to keep things going, just enough to keep you hopeful. And hope is dangerous when it's fed without substance. You told yourself this is what commitment looks like. That real love means staying when it's hard. But hard became the default, not the exception. The relationship didn't struggle occasionally, it struggled structurally. And love kept stepping in like an unpaid employee, covering endless shifts because if you didn't, everything would collapse. That fear kept you busy, too busy to notice how little was being carried on the other side. The imbalance shows up in small ways before it becomes obvious. You're the one checking in, the one adjusting expectations, the one calming tensions, the one making excuses to friends, the one asking if everything is okay while quietly ignoring that you're not. Love becomes a tool for endurance instead of a response to reciprocity, and the dangerous part is how noble it feels. Suffering gets romanticized. Loyalty becomes silence. Strength becomes tolerance. You start believing that your ability to love deeply is proof the connection is meaningful, instead of asking whether the connection is actually nourishing you. Love without mutual effort doesn't make a relationship strong. It makes one person tired. The other person might not even be cruel. That's what makes it harder. They might be comfortable, unchallenged, used to you absorbing the impact of their inconsistency. They get the benefits of your devotion without the discomfort of growth. And because you don't demand balance, imbalance becomes the norm. Not because they plotted it, but because you permitted it in the name of love. Over time, love starts covering for resentment. You feel it building, but you suppress it because resentment doesn't match the role you've assigned yourself. You're the understanding one, the patient one, the strong one. Admitting resentment would mean admitting something is wrong, and that threatens the identity you've built around holding everything together. The truth is, when love is doing all the work, the relationship isn't held together by two people choosing each other. It's held together by one person refusing to let go. And that refusal feels like devotion until it costs you your voice, your boundaries, your sense of fairness. You don't leave because you still care. You stay because you've invested too much to admit the return has been unequal. Eventually, exhaustion replaces confusion. You stop asking what went wrong and start feeling the weight of carrying something that was never meant to be carried alone. You realize love shouldn't feel like management. It shouldn't feel like persuasion. It shouldn't feel like constantly proving your worth through sacrifice. Love isn't supposed to be the only thing keeping a connection alive. When you finally step back, things become painfully clear. The effort you thought was mutual was actually mirrored by your own reflection. The consistency you admired was your own. The depth you believed existed was something you brought with you. And that realization hurts more than rejection, because it means the relationship didn't fail suddenly. It survived as long as it did because you kept reviving it. Love can be powerful, but it isn't meant to compensate for lack of effort, lack of accountability, lack of alignment. When love does all the work, it doesn't make the connection stronger. It delays the moment you have to face that you were building something on your own and calling it together. Red flags were renamed as depth, and that translation cost you clarity. At first, it sounded sophisticated, mature. You told yourself not everything is black and white, that people are layered, that complexity is a sign of intelligence and emotional richness. And suddenly, behaviors that should have made you pause became proof that you were dealing with profound. Mood swings became passion, avoidance became mystery. Emotional inconsistency became trauma you were patient enough to understand. Calling it depth made it easier to stay. It made discomfort feel meaningful. If something hurt, it wasn't wrong, it was just complex. If something confused you, it wasn't a warning, it was an invitation to look deeper. You stopped trusting your instincts and started intellectualizing your unease. Because instincts are simple, and you didn't want something simple. You wanted something that felt important. Depth became the excuse that kept everything running. When communication broke down, it wasn't disrespect, it was emotional difficulty. When boundaries were crossed, it wasn't selfishness, it was fear of intimacy. When accountability disappeared, it wasn't avoidance, it was complexity. You weren't being ignored, you were being challenged. And challenges sound noble when you're trying to justify staying. There's a certain pride that comes with believing you can handle someone others couldn't, that you see something special beneath the chaos, that you're patient enough, emotionally intelligent enough, strong enough to love someone difficult, and that belief feeds the illusion. It makes you feel chosen not because they chose you well, but because you chose to endure them. The problem is depth doesn't require damage. Emotional richness doesn't come packaged with constant confusion. Someone can be layered and still be consistent. Someone can have a past and still take responsibility for their present behavior. But when red flags are renamed as depth, standards quietly disappear. You stop asking for clarity because ambiguity has been reframed as intelligence. You stop asking for stability because instability has been rebranded as passion. Over time, you become the translator of bad behavior. You explain it to yourself. You explain it to others. You smooth out the sharp edges so the relationship looks reasonable from the outside. And the more you explain, the less space there is to simply acknowledge that something feels wrong. Because admitting that would mean the depth you admired was actually a pattern you ignored. What's dangerous is how convincing the narrative becomes. You tell yourself shallow people wouldn't understand this connection, that ordinary relationships are boring, that intensity and confusion are the price of something extraordinary, and suddenly peace feels dull, predictability feels empty. You start craving emotional turbulence because it validates the story you've been telling yourself. Red flags don't disappear when you rename them. They just stop being questioned. They settle in. They become familiar. And familiarity is deceptive. It feels like safety even when it's slowly draining you. You learn how to navigate around the mood shifts, the silent treatments, the emotional withdrawals. You adapt so well that you forget adaptation isn't the same as being treated well. The truth is, depth adds clarity. It doesn't remove it. It makes communication more honest, not more confusing. It invites accountability, not excuses. When something is truly deep, it can be examined without falling apart. Red flags demand avoidance. They survive only when you don't look at them directly. That's why renaming them is so effective. Language changes perception. Perception changes tolerance. Eventually, the emotional weight catches up. You feel tired not because love is hard, but because you've been carrying tension that never resolves. You realize you've been growing around problems instead of growing together. And the shocking part isn't that the red flags were there. It's how skilled you became at convincing yourself they were something else. You didn't lack awareness. You lacked permission to trust it. Because the moment you stop calling red flags depth, the illusion collapses. You see that what you admired wasn't complexity, it was inconsistency. What you defended wasn't vulnerability, it was emotional unavailability. What you called passion was volatility. And once the language changes back, the truth becomes impossible to ignore, because depth doesn't ask you to sacrifice your peace to prove your loyalty. It doesn't require constant interpretation. It doesn't make you earn basic respect through patience. And when you finally stop romanticizing the warning signs, you're left with a clarity that doesn't feel poetic, but it feels honest. And honesty doesn't need drama to be real.